Welcome to this week's video on My Hero Academia. This week I'll be looking at a timeline where the UA traitor was never caught. Needless to say, if you haven't seen Season 7 or read this far into the manga, this video will be filled to the brim with spoilers. So if you don't want anything spoiled for you, switch the video off now.
Yeah.
Now, I know what some of you are going to be thinking. Chris, you big dummy, if the traitor wasn't found, then All For One would have won, and maybe, look, but I feel that if you end up having that point of view, that it runs the risk of overlooking a few key details, as I don't think this would end up being an instant win for our villains, as honestly, to suggest that it would be some kind of instant win would be rather silly to me. Our heroes aren't lacking in agency. They're able to formulate plans and schemes to the best of their abilities and will be able to deal with whatever All For One throws to them to a certain extent, depending on just how much he's throwing at them at the given time. And whilst they may be on the back foot, they may be able to figure out something to try and help them out, but of course it all ends up depending on what exactly he's throwing at them. And by this point in the story, most of the major planning and scheming on behalf of the heroes was being done by pro-heroes and law enforcement agencies, things that Aoyama wouldn't be able to find directly, and the longer all this goes on, the less important to All For One's plans Aoyama's ends up being. I mean, sure, Aoyama might be able to find a couple things out here and there, but I don't think he'd be able to find anything truly substantial to really make things easier for All For One, and given the timeline of events, I really don't think that Aoyama was going to get a chance to have an extra meeting with All For One unless he had some mega reveal to give to him, which it's really hypothetical as to what that might end up being, so whatever, we're getting a little bit distracted now. In any case, we need to establish exactly what All For One's plan was, because it isn't fair, right, or accurate to just boil this all down to, oh, he takes over Tomura's body, then he finds and defeats All Might and Midoriya, because there is a far bigger plan at place here, which is implied by the timing of certain events. A plan that I can translate and interpret as follows. 1. Wait for Tomura to be healed ahead of the final battle, and then once he's ready, move on to the following stages. 2. Send Spinner off to launch the Heteromorph Riot. This will be used as a cover to release Kurogiri. 3. Whilst this is happening and the heroes are distracted, liberate Giganta. Both points 2 and 3 happen simultaneously. With the heroes distracted and separated by this series of events, launch the final attack on UA. The saboteurs will be activated, trapping everyone in the facility. Giganta will be used to lead the attack. The core of All For One's forces will use Kurogiri's quirk to appear within the compound. If Midori is there, they'll be forcing him out to try and capture him. If not, then the whole battle itself will end up drawing him out and using it as a form of bait. Liberating Giganta and Kurogiri was the first act of All For One's grand final attack plan. He wouldn't be able to hide Giganta for too long, given that he was sprung from prison, and the heroes will be on high alert, limiting the potential of a surprise attack, so he'd have to strike as soon as possible, almost from the moment the Giganta is released from his little holding cell. All For One's final attack on UA would have to happen the same day as the liberation of these two villains, or at the very least within a couple days of that happening, as whilst this series ignores modern day surveillance technology, All For One would be well aware of that kind of stuff and would not want to take the risk of getting tracked down by some kind of heat signature coming off Giganta or from some other kind of tracking technology being used to lock on their current position. And for the record, I feel that Spinner likely wouldn't factor into many of All For One's plans for this big final attack. All For One unleashing his minions at the start of this final battle arc looked like a reflex action, something that was done out of haste. The attack on the prison holding Giganta and the hospital holding Kurogiri looks far too organised to be a reflex action. This suggests to me that both these events were supposed to happen around the same time as one another, with the riot acting as some form of distraction in the process of helping the other team liberate Giganta. Now, in fairness, it wasn't going to be a pure distraction strategy because, truth be told, All For One could have done that with just about anybody with anything. However, with the end goal still being to liberate Kurogiri in some form or another, I still don't think that All For One really cared if Spinner would be the one to actually save him or make it back at all. And I doubt that Spinner knew that it was being used as a form of bait, and I really doubt if All For One really cared if the riot built into a greater rebellion, at least not personally, and I really don't think he cares much for Spinner. If he survives, sure, he becomes useful. If not, then he, well, dies and becomes something of a martyr to his cause, something that he could use at a later date. Regardless, however, it's established that our heroes knew about this whole riot event well in advance, so that does prove that it was in some regard pre-planned. We can't definitively say as though it and the liberation of Giganta were supposed to be part of a larger mission, but deep down I think that it will be, and for the sake of this what if, that's the point of view that we're going to be going with here. Because as we know from canon, Koda and Shoji knew that there was going to be this riot coming up at some point, and that's why they made the effort to be part of the team that were trying to stop it. And there's nothing to suggest that Aoyama knew that Koda and Shoji knew about the riot ahead of time, and there's nothing to suggest that he would have had any kind of knowledge about the riot itself taking place, so it's not as though he would be able to give All For One some kind of heads up at, oh yeah, these two students are going to be part of this mission to try and stop this riot that you're doing, because, well, why would he know that the riot has anything to do with All For One? And his main focus, I think, is more about trying to monitor Midoriya as well as the wider defences of the facility, more so than it is about the minutiae of what team's going where at what given point during their whole, well, just day-to-day duty doing hero patrols and what have you. However, with all that in mind, how do things turn out? Well, I think it's best that we start off with the bad ending first, and then we get into something a little bit more potentially optimistic, depending on your point of view, in the scenario ending after this. So let's kick off with a timeline where pretty much everything goes as planned for All For One. In which case, both Kirigiri and Giganta are released with very little issue, and then he launches his attack on UA. How successful or not this attack is hard to say, and to be honest, it is a case of it being kind of relative, because All For One's plan at the end of the day is to take over the world. The people that are under his command ultimately pawns in a great scheme, so if they die, they die. He is not going to really lose sleep about it. So if you've got a favourite villain, well, there's a good chance that if they die, he's really not going to be losing sleep over it. Giganta is a wild card, however, with all of this, because we know how he feels about All For One and Tomura in canon at this particular point in juncture, so it's kind of hard to say exactly what impact he'd have on everything, but I think it's fair to say that he's not going to be much of a willing participant in all of this, and for the sake of just keeping this rather neat, we're going to say that he's dealt with rather swiftly when it becomes clear that he isn't going to listen to orders. Kirigiri, however, of the two of them, his liberation feels like it's the more consequential, because as long as he gets freed, that means that All For One has pretty much scope to go wherever he wants in the world, so it will make any attempts by our heroes to escape incredibly difficult. As I've said previously, to act as though this would all translate to some kind of instant win for All For One, I think is a little silly, because that would end up implying that our heroes are totally without any kind of agency or forethought or planning. Because the truth of the matter is that the moment that Giganta or Kirigiri are liberated, it's at that point UA is going to go on high alert, ready for any kind of attacks coming their way, so they're not going to be totally with their trousers down, but at the same time, the storm that's going to be coming for them, oh hell, it's going to end up being the most difficult fight that any of them will have ever had in their entire lives. The truth of the matter is that the heroes do have the skill and power to go down not without a fight. But depending on the scale and nature of this big final battle, what exactly they can end up doing to try and save the day is rather limited, and I feel that at the end of the day, all they're ultimately going to end up doing is really just holding the line whilst the civilians and possibly Midoriya are evacuated. I mean, sure, they could still win and defeat All For One, but it's going to be a long, bloody and costly fight. Or at least they could try and fight them off and force them into retreat, but I really can't see that happening, because for the villains, this is an all or nothing affair. If they lose, they're all going to die, or spend the rest of their lives in prison, so they're going to fight with a level of almost bestial brutality to try and stop that from happening, which means that it's going to lead to a very bloody, nasty, horrible fight for our remaining heroes, which, even if they do win, this is going to leave them so physically and psychologically scarred that it's going to feel like a hell of a hollow victory. However, after hours of bloody, merciless fighting and bitter, self-indulgent cruelty, All For One would end up winning and taking UA. If not by overpowering our heroes, then our heroes having to make a tactical withdrawal and just letting him take it. A decision which will break the hearts of many of the younger heroes, with many of them wanting to, for want of a better phrase, die with their boots on. Regardless, the defeat at UA would be a major critical blow to the heroes of Japan, and it will be one that would be incredibly hard for the heroes to really come back from. there would be a mass evacuation of any remaining civilians at Midoriya and any remaining heroes. This would be the end of the formal defense of the nation and the beginning of All For One's new Dark Age, with our heroes effectively being forced to act as a resistant movement, swapping places with the villains in the story as they exist in the shadows, trying to defeat All For One and his grand new society from the shadows. Maybe in time Midoriya would be able to defeat All For One, maybe he would be able to find a future successor, providing that he actually has the time and chance to do so. With Ragdoll's quirk and Kurogiri's powers, All For One could really easily track Midoriya down, and it's likely he won't stop searching for him, at least until he finds him and deals with him once and for all. Or maybe he'll just let him live for now, knowing full well that there isn't much Midoriya can really do in the meantime. But in the meantime, this would end up meaning the end of the Hero Society in Japan and the end of Japan as a nation, as All For One now has UA, the throne room of his own petty kingdom, and with Kurogiri's power and the displayed willingness of certain governments to try and cut a deal with the All For One, it will soon end up growing to the seat of a far darker world, one that Midoriya and his successors are very unlikely to find anyone willing to help them, if indeed they're still alive to try and mount some kind of defence at all. However, this is a scenario that only works if we go out of our way to acknowledge the timing of events and how certain events in canon could have gone, because let's be bloody honest here, there are a lot of events in this past season which came down to the wire, and the idea that this could easily have blown up in All For One's face is really a reality that we have to embrace here. So with that said, let us get to an alternate scenario. Okay, so it's the day of the attack. We don't know exactly what time, but given how future scenes seem to have gone, we'll say that it's the early afternoon. Spinner is sent out to start the riot, and the second team is sent out to try and spring Giganta out of prison. The second team is going to remain hidden for as long as possible, at least until they get their heads up to launch their attack, with Spinner and his group making their way towards the hospital, causing a fuss and causing a rumpus every step of the way. As they're all getting into position, our core cast's activities will remain the same as usual. However, Koda and Shoji will have gone on patrol, aka being sent to deal with this riot that they all know is coming down the pipeline. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if a few other cast members are sent along with them, as if nothing else, it would help to build up the cover story that they're just going out on patrol. Who would end up going with them, I can't end up saying, but hey, I'm open to suggestions. And given that the heroes haven't committed the bulk of their manpower to this big ambush idea, there's probably a greater level of security at the hospital than there was before. Now, how successful or not this attack on the hospital would end up being is a little bit harder to say, but given the heroes knew this event was coming up and that there would be more heroes present to try and stop Spinner, and given just how close things came within the main canon to try and get Kurogiri out, this might be the thing that ends up stopping him escaping outright, because if nothing else, the fight to try and stop Spinner getting into the hospital may just be long enough that it gives Present Mike enough time to deal with Kurogiri as he almost did within the main storyline. However, with that said, All For One didn't need to do his big reflex action to bring up on the bulk of all his best forces to try and defend himself, so there may be extra villains as part of this big riot thing to keep an eye on it and make sure that things go his way. Either way, it's going to translate into a far brutal and longer-winded fight than what we ended up getting in canon, but I am honestly erring on the side that the heroes might be able to pull this one off. It might be a narrower victory, but I think that at the end of the day, just given how close things got within the main canon, and given how much a better position the heroes might end up being in this particular instance, I think they're more likely to get the win. What that win ends up looking like is a little bit harder to say, given, you know, how things could have ended up going, but we'll say at least the villains failed to get Kurogiri out. As all that is going on, we get the attempt to get Giganta out of his prison, and I see this going pretty much exactly as it did in canon, though I will admit that I'm not entirely sure as to whether or not any of our main cast members will actually be there as part of this big defense of it. I don't know if they were there as part of a guard rotation, or they were just there anyway, or they were sent there as part of this larger battle to try and make sure that no one set him out, but, you know, this is an event that is just so consequential that I'm not going to hand wave it away and say, oh, whatever, people are there, it doesn't matter, because it really does matter because of reasons I'm about to get onto. Because we all know where Giganta is going to the moment he gets let out. Because I'm going to be honest with you, dear listener, I can't see a scenario where Giganta doesn't escape from his prison, because, Quite frankly, our heroes wouldn't know ahead of time that an attempt was going to be made to release him. Oh sure, they know about it as far as the stuff with the Riot and Kurogiri, that's something that they could come to a logical conclusion about. But from what I know and from what I've read, there doesn't seem to be any kind of evidence that they knew an attempt was going to be made on Giganta's prison. And as far as we're aware, the only reason why there were extra forces in that area was purely and simply because they had this big ambush thing going on and they didn't want to run the risk that Giganta would end up getting released. Now, if it turns out that pretty much the exact same characters from canon happen to be there defending the facility at the time that this attack is taking place, then this would lead to a scenario where Giganta ends up leading the heroes to All For One's location, which would help the main cast get a lock on All For One's location, but would also end up meaning that these heroes would end up having to hide as soon as it becomes clear exactly where they are, or fighting for their very lives until backup arrives, if any arrives in time at all. And given that one of the heroes that we know that was there in canon, or rather one that we know was there as part of the defense in canon, happens to have a power that can make people do whatever he says, oh boy, that would really make for a nightmare if All For One happened to steal that power. Of course, Giganta would still end up fighting All For One and Tomura, but, you know, the idea that All For One might be about to get a supremely powerful quirk by just our heroes trying to be heroic, I think that's the more alarming headline amongst all of this. Alternatively, if different characters are present for the defense, either different mainline main characters or just a bunch of generic goons who have to be squashed because drama, then this leads to a scenario where Giganta charges after All For One. Our heroes won't be able to track him as easily, as by the time they get a good lock on him, well, it's going to be too late for Giganta. As such, we get something similar to what ends up happening with canon, with Giganta attacking All For One and Tomura for betraying him. Now, let's be blunt, Giganta lacks the raw power to put both of them down for good, and the truth of the matter is that the longer this fight goes on for, the harder that he fights, the less willing that All For One and Tomura are to put him down, then this will end up leaving them with greater injuries, which will end up hindering them in any kind of upcoming battles. I mean, it could still end up making for this great dramatic moment and a callback to when Tomura was training with Giganta during the My Villain Academia arc, with Tomura being forced to put Giganta down, this bringing back terrible memories of that time that he accidentally killed his dog as a child, memories that would end up undermining the control that All For One has over him. To what extent that he undermines it, I'll leave it open. Maybe this leads to an event where Tomura rebels against All For One, maybe he spares Giganta so the pair of them can try and defeat All For One. Who knows? That's for other people to figure out because we're getting rather late into the video. Regardless of what may or may not come further down the pipeline, Giganta is going to end up getting killed by all of this, and All For One will know that their current location will have been compromised and they're going to have to attempt to flee. If Kurogiri was successfully liberated, then All For One will be forced to spring his attack on UA as soon as possible and hope that Tomura hasn't taken too much damage, because now that it's clear that Giganta has escaped, like I said previously, the security around UA is going to be the highest it has ever been, and it's going to make any attempts at attacking there significantly harder. If Kurogiri wasn't liberated, as I think he wouldn't have been, then he'd be forced to lay low and to try and figure out what the hell had just happened, with All For One then having to push the attack back and to try and draw in as many remaining villains as he can to formulate a new plan. Now, given how things will have just gone, with Giganta getting killed in front of them, Tomura being forced to do it, Spinner either being dead, in prison or missing, the mood on the villain side is going to be dark. The kind of dark that makes Spin start to reconsider who the boss really should end up being. If Spinner had survived, unless Kurogiri was liberated, he'd only end up returning to the cave base as planned, where he'd end up getting captured anyway, and the heroes present would likely take him to UA, at least for the meantime. And once word of that reaches All For One, thanks to Aoyama still being the traitor and still being active, that would allow him an opportunity to focus the attention of the villains under his command into making this big final attack, as an attempt to try and save their friend and to put the world right, to focus their attention, to refresh their minds as to why they're really doing all of this. All For One would know just how close the villains are to one another, and he could use that to try and disarm any attempts at a changing management thanks to the power of friendship. This would help him hold on to power for a little bit longer. How much longer is harder to say because we are getting towards the end of the story at this particular moment. What exactly comes next after all of this is harder to say. With potentially 3 of the main villains being taken out of play one way or another, the chances of victory for All For One become narrower. Not impossible, but still harder. But the longer that things take, the more likely it is that Aoyama is going to get caught or the sabotage plot is uncovered. He can't just hide in the shadows. Oh sure, he might have alternate plans. I mean, hell, he may well be aware of Eri and her power, as he states he is in the main canon, and he could try and capture her if he's really pushed for some kind of Hail Mary to end up saving the day for him, but that is one that could go horribly for all involved. And so there we have it, two very different timelines. One where our heroes are caught out by Earth One's plans and we enter into a far darker future, and one where they manage to get the one important win when it mattered the most. Now granted, a lot of this comes down to just how much Aoyama would have been made aware of, but even if he was aware of a few more details here and there and could tip off Earth One about a few of them, Giganta's mental state is something that neither one of them would know about ahead of time. And the lack of support for Spinner, aside from the villains that we see him with, makes me feel that very little would change as far as the liberation of Kurogiri. Because the simple fact of the matter is that I feel that Alpha 1 still would have known that some students would still be there as part of the defence, so I don't really think much would have ended up changing there really at all, even if Aoyama knew that Koda and Shoji or any other students would be sent there, as he likely took that into consideration when he made his plans in canon anyway. But hey, if you have any suggestions as to what he might have done next in this scenario, let me know in the comment section down below. Now before we wrap up, I will just say that in my original version of this script that I wrote several weeks ago, before everything with Giganta kicked off, I did highlight Giganta as being a potential problem for the villains. I just never imagined it would end up being this much of a problem for them, but hey, thank you all for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I apologise if it feels a little bit weird, because there's a lot at play here that I think still needs kneeling down, and there's an argument to be made that I should probably have held off doing this until the next season is done. But in any case, I hope you all enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section down below. Thank you all for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye! Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!